Good afternoon. Once again, we are live and up and running. So let me get everything switched over to the correct layout, and we will kick off today's Beatbox Jam stream. All right, I think we got video and audio. I'm just going to throw on a real quick loop that I did right before the stream, some background, and then we will talk about what is on the agenda for today. Yeah, this one shouldn't be too loud, hopefully. I tweaked my audio settings a little. It shouldn't really make a big difference, but when I'm doing warm-up stuff, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the audio levels to make sure we're not blowing out the audio. I think I need to buy a new arm for my mic. This thing does not want to stay up. It keeps falling down. But we'll put it right here, and hopefully that'll be enough so I'm audible on the stream. So what are we looking at for today? Today's Beatbox Jam stream is going to follow pretty much the same format as all of them. We'll start off with some intro and warm-up, some drills to get the blood flowing, get everything warmed up. After that, we'll spend some time talking about technique, sound theory. One thing I want to focus on a little bit today is kind of a return to the idea of practicing using basics as a foundation, something we've talked about a few times. I want to kind of build on the previous discussion and maybe throw in some stuff that I haven't talked about before when it comes to practicing and some techniques for just repetition and stuff like that. So that will be the technique sound theory part of the discussion. And then for BGM today, we're going to be trying something a little different for BGM creation. I want to test out a new type of challenge since we don't have really any sort of challenges for the BGM brainstorming. And I'll get to that when we get to the second part of the stream and explain how it works. That way people will know what I'm doing. They jump on midstream. And that should give us a decent amount of stuff to cover today. Let's go ahead and turn this one off. And with that, we will start warm up. So I'll run through some somewhat simple freestyle beats, which will give me a chance to double check audio. And we'll go ahead and kick things off. So we'll leave the mic just about there for now, and then I'll keep an eye on the audio readout as we go. So let's get started. All right. Seems like we went a little bit longer on just the warm up freestyle than I usually do, which is good. I think it's good to spend time getting warmed up, and those opening sets of beats kind of chain together, kind of help give practice for freestyling, working towards our other challenges that we've done here on stream, where I try and freestyle for a set amount of time without stopping. And with the last personal best, I think it was like 23 minutes or so straight without completely stopping and taking a break. So, in a way, doing like the real simple kind of warm up beats, which tend not go quite as hard and complex. Ooh, voice crack. As what we do on the challenges where I'm trying to actively freestyle stuff back to back to back. Still good practice. And we'll get back to the challenge for freestyling at some point in the future. But let me change my caption real quick. Sorry. Technique sound theory. And so I did want to spend some time on the stream like we usually do, breaking down some ideas and some concepts when it comes to learning beatboxing and practicing and giving yourself tools to be able to kind of evolve and progress. Just that I've gathered over the several years or so I've been doing it. I always preface these discussions with the disclaimer that I'm not a teacher. I'm not a professional beatboxer by any means. I'm just a big fan of the art form. I've been doing it for a little while. So these are opportunities for me to sort of pass on some things that I've learned along the way to people who might be interested in getting into beatboxing. So in addition to just interactive content on stream, these discussions kind of serve as a resource for people to refer back to in the future if they're interested in learning more and hearing what we talk about. So the main topic for the technique sound theory part of today's discussion goes back to something we've talked about several times in the past and spent some time breaking down, and that's the idea of basics. And the idea of basics is simple, but the concept is pretty limitless when it comes to the potential and ways you can apply the concept of basics to beatboxing itself. Just like learning every skill out there, whether it's a physical skill like an athletic skill or a more creative focused type of art skill, painting, drawing, music, or anything. It could be a technical skill like computer programming or math or science. I've always been of the opinion that it's easier to learn to walk before learning to run, which is a really tired and cliched phrase, I know, but it really does hold true in a lot of cases, if not any case, when it comes to learning something new. Nothing is physically preventing a person from wanting to start off at a more advanced level because they have an interest in it. But I found in my experience that if you do that, it gets tougher to learn sort of the basics after the fact because you're trying to skip ahead in the lesson, as it were. So we talked a bit about this, and I want to kind of build on the discussion from before and kind of revisit some things again for people who may not have seen our previous discussions on the ideas of basics and applying basics to beatboxing. So, real world example in beatboxing as a specific type of skill you're learning. If you're completely new to beatboxing, let's say you're a person with no musical background, maybe you are a fan of music, but you weren't formally trained or studied any sort of music theory or principle, which is a lot of people. And you see beatboxing, you want to get into it. Assuming you're not going into like a structured learning environment where you're being taught by an actual beatboxing instructor, let's also assume that you're just learning on your own. You're going to be self-taught and figure everything out for yourself, which is my arc in beatboxing. I didn't start with a teacher. I did study under one for a bit, but that's not where I started. So assuming all of those things, and you want to get into beatboxing because you saw something that piqued your interest. Usually it's a YouTube video, or maybe you saw a performance, someone actually doing it in the real world, and you thought, that's really cool, I want to learn how to do that. So path one, let's assume you're doing things out of order just for the sake of example, and let's say, okay, you saw someone do like a real crazy technicality pattern or maybe a really strong, powerful bass in a performance or video, and you said, that looks really cool, I want to learn how to do that cool thing I saw. Well, there's nothing physically stopping you from tracking down tutorials once you can figure out the terminology. Like, let's say you heard someone do a really low vocalized bass, like a vibration or a low throat bass, and it resonated with you, and it's what you want to learn. Well, there's nothing stopping you from going onto YouTube and looking up a tutorial saying, here's how you do a throat bass, starting with the technique and getting the and getting that to come out. You can absolutely learn how to do that just by watching tutorials, and you'll be able to get the technique and figure out how to do it. The challenge with jumping that far ahead and establishing the toolkit before you've done everything before is that you've got to figure out how to take this thing that you've learned and actually apply it to creating a beat. And again, assuming no prior background, no existing knowledge or skills of beatboxing, starting off with a vocalized bass before you've done anything else, I think is not the most effective way to learn. You could do it, but at some point you're going to have to go back a few steps and say, okay, I've got a bass, what do I do with it? And the point of the discussion is such that if you did it on path B in a different order, and let's say you saw all this stuff and you still wanted to learn beatboxing with no background starting at the ground floor, but instead you said, okay, that bass thing is really cool, but where do people typically start? What's the first thing people learn when it comes to beatboxing? Which is a fair question. And the answer would be, like we talk about here and there on the streams on this channel, it's a tool set akin to drums, like a drum set. And when you're starting to learn, you have to figure out how to create all of the individual components of the drum set in order to get the components to fit together and become a beat. And again, sounds really basic and simple, but that's kind of the point. And I know people, especially younger people, tend to really want to plow ahead and learn all the cool stuff, but it will help you in the long run to start with the basics and then build on that. And then once you have a good grasp of the fundamentals, just at an elementary level, you could start choosing where you want to specialize and what things you want to focus on, since not everybody follows the same arc when it comes to learning the techniques. Some people go straight towards the bases. Some people tend to skew more towards the technicality side. Some people skew towards the melodic side for composition. There's a whole bunch of different avenues, and no one way is correct. But you'll have a much easier time branching out once you've essentially grown the trunk of the tree. And to that end, to kind of elaborate and demonstrate what I'm talking about, I always recommend that people start with the three core instruments of the rhythm section when it comes to beatboxing: the kick, a hat, and a snare. And where you sort of start with the snare, I think, is the biggest variable in how people learn. But to kind of recap a discussion we've had before, I think the easiest way to start, there's two easy options I think I would recommend to people, and I would try both and see which one clicks better if I was in the instructor position and actually teaching someone hands-on, right? So you start with a kick, which goes back to the whole boots and cats thing, which we'll get to when it comes to the snare. But for just the kick itself, a strong B or a P sound is where they tell everyone to start. It's one of the most basic intro concepts to beatboxing. I think it's pretty much universal when it comes to how you explain a kick. So we're talking about like a b sound without the vocalization, and you drop that off and learn how to just create that pressure with your lips. And it doesn't have to be a super hard force in the beginning. You can do like a super powerful kick, like a, but won't really benefit you much to do that right out the gates because it's harder to do, takes more effort. Just a simple. And I think most people, even people completely new to beatboxing with no musical background, can figure out how to do that probably in about 10 minutes or less. Not terribly difficult or complex, but it's the cornerstone sound of beatboxing. You very rarely will have a beat constructed without some sort of kick, with a few exceptions, but in general, your type of rhythm is going to be driven by a kick drum. The next component after that would be a hat. And hats, I think, are easier to explain. Hats take even less time to learn because you can start with just a T sound, which is how they're typically denoted in beatbox notation. So just a closed hat, simple sound. I think that someone can get that in a minute if you just say, make a T sound. Maybe if you're not an English speaker, it might be difficult if that's not a sound in your first language. But again, basic concept, let's assume. Hat, probably the simplest of the three to learn because it's exists pretty commonly out there in language. So you have closed hat, pretty simple. The third one, the snare, is the most complicated of the three basic elementary sounds, and there's a couple ways I would instruct someone to figuring out which snare is easier for them to do. The first of the two options, I think, is the K snare, an outwards K snare, because if you follow the old boots and cats example, the cats, the sharp C sound or K, they're created the same way, can become a snare if you just drop the ats off of cats. So you're taking that sharp consonant sound, the C or K sound, and you're using that as your snare, and your focus in the short term is just getting that sharp and forceful so that instead of just, boots and cats with a soft sound, it's more of a cat, a sharper sound. So it would be something like, and that would be the basic backbone of your three core instruments if you did it that way. Another way I've thought about explaining it to people when it comes to learning their first snare, if they either didn't want to or are having trouble learning how to get that K sound isolated, which some people it might be more difficult than others. It just depends on how your brain's wired. Instead of doing a K snare, starting with a PF snare is another option, but it's a little bit trickier to do because it's not as natural of a motion to actually get the sound to come out. And for me, I think I learned how to do the PF snare before I started doing case snares, because my case snare was done a little bit differently. I didn't learn it from the Boots and Cats example. I could talk about that in a sec, but the way I learned the case snare was a bit different, kind of by accident, really. But for PF, it's just a single P sound, an unvocalized, sounds kind of like a B. They're pretty synonymous in this case, but you're dropping the E from P and just going. If you get it more punched, then it starts to become a B, and you're essentially getting into kick territory. But just a for the P sound, and then the F is just the letter F without any sort of vocalization, just a f. Those are two sounds that compose or comprise the PF snare, and the trick is learning how to do them together. And having tried to explain this to people before, that's the most unnatural part, which makes the snare a little bit harder to learn. But all you have to do to practice, at least as far as I can tell when it comes to explaining this to people that are completely new, is just do the sounds one after the other and then slowly put them closer and closer together until they become one sound. So you have the separate sounds, and just think of like you're moving them together from the sides until they meet in the middle. So you have and that's where they meet in the middle. So when you're getting close, make like an 8th note or 16th note, and you're shortening it a little bit and a little bit while still getting the sound to come out until you're doing them both at the same time, and that's how you get the. And PF snare requires actually quite a bit of practice to get clean. When I was first doing it a long time ago now, my PF snare I could get to come out, but it was not sharp and it didn't have a real kind of clean, crisp sound to it. And it's not really a clean, crisp sound by default. It's kind of dull. It's like you're hitting a snare head. But the is pretty easy to practice, which we'll kind of go into when we get to the drills and the ideas of how to take these basics and practice them. And what I'll do is I'll explain both branches from the starting 3 instruments just to kind of follow up on those examples. But the PF snare is just repetition, just like any other snare. And as you do that, you get faster, the ability to train those PF snares back to back and also get them to come out more cleanly and consistently, which is the big thing. Getting the sound to be consistent and pretty much just second nature when it comes to how you're thinking about it, and like a muscle memory drill or exercise. That's kind of the end goal with anything in beatboxing. And the PF snare, I think, requires a bit more ramp up time, but I found that you can kind of take that technique and adapt it into a lot of interesting things. And the case snare, you can do the same thing with, but I feel like you're going to run into kind of more of a plateau with that one. It just depends on how a person thinks. Someone might be able to get the idea to click easier with one versus the other. Hence, I think it's good from an instruction perspective to just have more than one option and then try both with someone who's learning, see what makes the most sense, and then from there, work on drilling and getting better, and then you're off and running. So thinking about the idea of getting the 3 basic sounds, and again, this is going to be a bit more of a simple breakdown for today, just because I think it'd be good to have this kind of discussion every once in a while as, again, a resource for people who might see this in the future and want to learn about beatboxing and where to start. That doesn't mean what I suggest is the be-all end-all. Again, I'm not an instructor, but it worked for me, and if it works for somebody else, then great. And if it doesn't, there's plenty of resources you can look at to find something that does work for you. But taking the idea of the 3 core sounds, kick, hat, snare. Okay, going back to the completely new person learning beatboxing example, you've picked up the 3 sounds, over a course of maybe a few days, and you've figured out how to do these 3 sounds. So now what do you do with them? Chances are most people who are learning these in a non-structured environment are just going to start putting things together to play around with the idea of creating a beat. And like we're talking about here with building fundamentals and basics when it comes to the techniques, starting simple until you get a good feel for construction and how to put things together is going to help you, as opposed to taking these and immediately sprinting to something really complex. Because you can take a kick, hat, and a snare and say, okay, I've got the components now. I want to do like a really complex dubstep beat and try and do that. I think that's very difficult, and I wouldn't recommend people try and do that, but you could, versus starting simple and working up slowly to get comfortable and get a good command of being able to use the tools. I think works better. Just to kind of illustrate, let's say you're taking the three sounds. We'll go kick, hat, and the K snare, which I got to think of how to do it at a more simple level, but it's fine. And let's say you're practicing just real simple, like a 4/4-ish type beat. Just and again, not the most elaborate and sexy beat in the world, but it's simple. And to someone who's brand new, it's probably not going to be just without a second thought simple. So getting into the sort of flow of putting the sounds together and repeating them consistently, and most importantly, I think, being able to just keep time and stay on beat, on meter, and get used to that, if, again, assuming no musical background, I think is one of the most important things you can learn and focus on early on. Because if you don't, and let's say you took these things and you're saying, okay, I want to jump ahead in the lesson, as it were, and let's say you tried to do a beat like this with the same sounds, and it's more complex. It might be sorry, threw technicality in there, didn't mean to do that. And this could be something that maybe influences your approach from maybe a song that you like, and you want to duplicate a beat you heard in something like a hip hop or rock or anything type beat, and you want to replicate that with the tools that you've learned so far. Again, you can do that, but it's going to be harder because you're putting a lot more advanced things on your path before you're really geared to do them. And you can learn that way. It's just going to be harder versus starting with the simple beats and practicing those so you get comfortable with it and get a good command of being able to do things without thinking about them, I think is more helpful. I know it sounds like I'm repeating myself when I hammer that point home, but just based on people I've talked to and their overall experience learning, the general impression I get is that it's more difficult to start at a more advanced level when you're still learning the basics. And you might find, even if you're starting slow and working your way up, the skill progression curve, as it were, if you think of it like a linear curve, is going to be very, very quick as far as time with skill built early on. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. But in the beginning, if you spend a day just learning how to do the three core sounds, I'm not saying all day, but let's say you spend a couple hours just learning how to do a kick, learning how to do a hat, and picking a snare and learning how to do a snare. Between that first day and the next 2 to 3 days, I would say, when you start applying those ideas and instrument concepts together, you're going to find that you're going to be able to create things without having to just grind individual sounds. Not everyone is going to kind of hit the same point at the same time, but the skill progression will seem pretty quick, because as your anatomy becomes familiar with doing all the different things and becomes second nature and the muscle memory takes over, you think about it less and you start thinking about how to do the sounds more consistently, more cleanly, and more quickly. And that does come relatively fast if you're practicing consistently. I would say if you can devote a couple hours a day for the first week to practicing all those things and starting to play around with the early concept of simple beats, From day 1 to day 7, let's say, you will see a pretty big difference if you practice just consistently and drill with doing those things over and over again. And I understand that a lot of people, especially in today's culture, don't like the idea of delayed gratification because I think people are a little more impatient than they used to be. But you will see the results of practicing pay off relatively quickly. And if you focus on the basics to start, you'll see a progression just in that short time if you stick with it. And then from there, you start working on getting that stronger foundation. And I would say within maybe 2 weeks or so, you'd be able to step up the complexity and start moving on to the next level of techniques and things to learn. And just taking that time to form that foundation will help a lot, I think. Again, everyone's going to approach it differently, but if I had, let's say I had someone studying under me for some reason, wanting to learn beatboxing, they say, I want you to more or less teach me. My homework assignment for the first couple days would be taking the 3 core sounds, and I'll use PF snares in this example just to show the other side. I would say, I want you to be able to duplicate this beat and work on this beat for 1 to 3 days and just practice on replicating it as accurately as possible. And it would be something like, I will do the original sort of sample I did with the K snare. It would like, and even the rapid kick might be a little bit more advanced. So maybe we just go, and the assignment would be, okay, let's work on doing that for an extended amount of time with as few mistakes as possible. And that's your assignment. And as kind of like an additional thing for someone who's really ambitious, I would say, instead of adding more instruments, I want you to work on controlling the speed at different levels. So for starting, I don't know how many beats per minute this is, but just with the very simple, a 1 and 2 beat. First, I'd say practice slowing it down. So it would go from to and then ramp it back up or start over and then try doing it faster. So it'd go from to and if someone is really ambitious, I'd say try and do it faster than that. See how fast you can go while you're still learning and before it starts to fall apart. So you might get someone who's picked it up quickly, might be able to do it something like maybe that's a little fast, but and the idea is to force your brain to adapt to things changing on the fly and being able to take those 3 core sounds and adapt them to whatever it is you're trying to do and get used to that to build kind of familiarity with like a dynamic beat that's going to change. And so that would be something I would have someone work on within the first week. And then by the second week or so, or maybe towards the end of the first, depending on how often I talk to said person, I would say, okay, if you've been able to sort of get a good grasp on this simple beat with the kicks, hats, snares, try adding more kicks. I'd say that's the second sort of tier of complexity when it comes to building the basics. So instead of just kind of like I did initially, you might add a double kick in there, which it will be different when you're first learning because doing a versus a does feel different. It's not super difficult, but it is going to be different when it comes to constructing the beat. So you might change it from a to a which is like a single plus a double. And that would be your first level of adding something new and more complex to practice, and then work on getting good with that. Similarly, one thing I wanted to touch on real quickly is, in addition to putting the beats together and experimenting around with the combination of sounds, another really effective technique that a lot of professional beatboxers recommend, in conjunction with something like a metronome to give you control over speed and things like your tempo, would be just doing the sounds back to back alone over and over and over again, which I know can be boring, but it absolutely will help build proficiency and skill when it comes to the sounds. So, in addition to practicing putting things together, I think there's a lot of value to be had in just practicing the sounds over and over again. I did the same thing. I wish I did it more. But if we take the first section of the instruments in the set, your snare, start with quarter notes. Just 1, 2, 3, 4. You can't see what I'm doing with my hands, but I'm basically using my hand to be like my metronome in hitting each of the beats to be consistent. And unless you feel so compelled and you have the time, I don't think you need to sit there for 2 hours and do nothing but kicks straight. You could do that, and I guarantee your kicks will get good very fast if you do that, but chances are you're going to get bored after like 5 or 10 minutes of doing the same thing over and over again. I know I would. But taking time to drill just simple 1, 2 quarter note kicks, okay. In the first week, getting comfortable with doing that and getting that kick to come out the same way, the same speed, as it were, and the same volume, and just get it consistent. So you're not getting like a variation or variability. It's not going. It definitely will, as you get used to doing the sound, be inconsistent. But the more you practice doing it same way and just focus on that, eventually it'll become second nature and you won't even have to think about it, which is what you're ultimately aiming for when practicing individual sounds, be they basic or intermediate or advanced. By the same token, you work up from quarter notes to eighth notes. So just is your start, and then it becomes. And I think the jump from quarter notes to eighth notes would be a hurdle to someone who's new, maybe depending on how quickly they pick it up. But that is going to be a good second tier of practice. And if you can get good at that, it'll definitely set you up to be able to do more complex things relatively quickly. Because as you build speed and competency to do said speed consistently and cleanly, it'll just lead into all of the other aspects that are going to open things up. And then I'd say, instead of going from eighth notes to 16th notes, which is difficult, so instead of, it would be, that's relatively hard. That's something I'm practicing right now, is doing 16th notes, like super fast kicks, which it'd be, there's not a lot of beats I could think of where I would be doing a string of 16th note kicks, but definitely with fast ones, you're going to have 16th note rhythms in your kicks. So being able to do them rapidly, pretty handy. But before I recommended someone branch out into that level of speed, I would say go back to eighths and start working on doubles. So instead of just you add eighth note doubles in between your quarter notes. So after doing the eighth notes on their own on singles, I would say do double kicks in your drill patterns. So you do something like 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Becomes a gallop, like a gallop pace almost. And being able to do double kicks again is going to open up quite a bit of options when it comes to constructing beats. And I think that's usually the first level of complexity most people sort of build to, again, depending on your genre preference and your focus. But being able to do double kicks will instantly level your beats up. And I know it sounds a little bit corny to say, but it's true. Think about our test beat that we did when learning the being able to add doubles with the with the 1 2 3, the 2 3 being the doubles there, it's going to add complexity. You could even do something like a bit more of an irregular beat that focuses on a double kick specifically. And let's see, what's a good example for that? You could do maybe more of a dubstep beat. Not the greatest example because that's really more of like a rapid kick chain that would sound better, like a. But the idea of being able to take that more advanced use of the instrument and adapt it to something more complex, it holds true. And then, we're not going to spend all our time talking about kicks. We'll be here all day. But I would say going from eighths to doubles, then maybe start learning triples. And triples are a bit different in technique because there's an actual dedicated sound set for triples. But you could do 3 regular kicks in a row. People don't normally do it that way. Like, you could do it. It's hard, and you have to get really good at doing them quickly. But if you did something like that, could be very functional. My brain, because of the way I learned, is not wired to do triple kicks that way. Instead, I use the BTB for triple kicks just because that's what I learned and it feels the most natural. But that's a sound set versus just a sound back to back. Taking a B, T, B sound, B being the kicks, T being like a hat in the middle. It's a triplet sound set. That's how you get the, which the T becomes so muted you almost don't hear it, but it's breaking up the sound slightly, so you're getting in your ear auditorily 3 sounds. So you could have or. I think it's easier to do the BTB faster. Maybe if someone is just an absolute pro with kicks, they could do the faster, but that's hard. That is very advanced to be able to do, I think. Someone can learn the BTB faster than they can learn how to do a consistent actual triple kick. That's my opinion. I would be curious to see what the pros think about that, since everyone does things a little bit different, but I know the BTB is usually everyone's go-to when it comes to the triple kicks. So plugging that into like a more dubstep beat instead of the triple one, you would get something like, I'll do this PS snare. And that is your triplet kicks as a 3 sound set. And if you can incorporate the BTB as triple kicks when you're first learning in like the first couple weeks, you will be able to create some pretty complex things, I think. But it's all going to come down to your ability to manage time signatures and tempo and keep on beat, because you can incorporate triple kicks, but if you can't keep time, your beat tempo is going to go all over the place and your beat's going to basically be sloppy and fall apart. You could slow it down because the BTB can be done relatively slow. You can go so you could slow it down in the beginning. But as you ramp up and you learn how to slot in that sound, it's got a ton of potential. Triple kicks are fun. I like doing, if we're talking about practicing just for context, I like doing BTB chains in a row because it's hard to do and it forces you to get really good at repeating that sound set. So instead of just like a rapid single kick chain like we talked about, just that single kicks, which is a great way to practice. That is good practice because it teaches you single kick speed and it'll make your overall speed performance better. But practicing the triplets in chains, so it's basically sets of 3 3 3 3 3 3 3 3 3, that's a lot harder to do, and that sounds like which is like doing basically double bass pedals. And if you're trying to do something like replicate blast beats or something that's really, really fast, then being able to do chains of triple kicks in a row is extremely handy. And again, that's something I actively practice because I want to get better at doing that. Putting that into a beat, again, I'm not trying to show off, but I'm trying to demonstrate what you would do with something that fast. Maybe you have an extended kick line as part of your beat, so it's more of the focus of each measure. So it might be and that's basically just chaining triples and like slightly truncated doubles in conjunction. I won't split hairs on what it is, but basically you're taking that and slotting that in to have this rapid driving fast kick line, and that's fun to do. Doing beats like that tends to catch people's ear because it sounds very complex, but it's just practicing speed with a really basic concept. And I'd say you could probably get to triple, like relatively fast triple kicks in the first month if you drill them hard enough. But it all just depends on kind of your angle of attack and what you choose to focus on. And everyone's going to be a little different. But to sort of tie up the whole discussion about why basics are important, you start slow and get really comfortable with walking. And then when you get to the point where you want to learn to sprint and run, you'll be ready to go and you can take off. And so that's kind of more of a summary of what I've learned. I didn't follow that model necessarily. I kind of started in the middle, honestly, because I had some basic knowledge of how beatboxing worked without ever having studied it. I started off a little bit ahead of someone with like no background whatsoever, but not by much, by maybe just a week's worth of experience, just playing around with what I thought beatboxing was before I learned more about it. But I still tried to focus on the basics once I looked at, instruments and all the different types of snares and what I wanted to learn. I spent a lot of time just doing things over and over again, and I wish I'd done that a bit more. But it still seemed to work out. I can feel like I'm decently okay at beatboxing. I did want to hit on something I mentioned before I forget, because I've done that before in these discussions where I said I'll get to something and then just forget to get to it. And then I'll watch the archive footage when I'm QAing stuff for upload on YouTube, and I'll realize, hey, I didn't get back to that thing I mentioned, which is bad. I encourage people to call me out when I do that. But I mentioned my case snare was a bit of a different arc than most people when they're first learning the boots and cats. And so, to recap what I mentioned earlier in the stream, the case snare I learned didn't sound like a... I think I might have done them like that a long, long time ago just because I saw, oh, you just do boots and cats. But at some point, I learned how to do a case snare using mouth pressure, which is not an incorrect technique, and I don't think it's got a different name. It's just a different way of doing the case snare. And the way I figured out how to do that was by creating basically a sealed pocket of air in my mouth using my tongue and forcing the air using the K motion around that barrier to get it to pop. And so, again, if you're just using the back of your tongue to create a K sound and getting it sharp, that sounds like... It sounds kind of high in pitch to me, but it's a real kind of sharp, short snare. If you're doing it with mouth pressure, you're basically taking your tongue and putting it in the way of your airway to block it, and then doing that same K sound, but because it's blocked, you're having to force more pressure for the air to go around your tongue, and it comes out in a burst. And so that sounds like... Again, for comparison, a regular boots and cats case snare, as sharp and strong as I can do it, versus a mouth pressure case snare, which sounds like... So, versus... The second one hits way harder. It's got more force, it's got more punch, and maybe it sounds better because I don't practice just a regular unvocalized case sound. I never use that type of case snare. But the one I use, and your tongue doesn't really move. It stays in the same spot for as long as you want to do that sound. It's just sealing, and then you're popping it, and then it's resealing. So, and as you practice, you can do that relatively quickly. I don't think I could do 16ths with it, but if I shorten it, I could do 16ths. So it's like kind of like the gun cock sound, which is done a little bit differently. People use like a outwards K plus a rim shot to do the double cock, like gun cock sound. Or I guess you could do it if you're using the one that I'm doing. But for some reason, that was just the way I gravitated towards K snares. And I should have asked my teacher years ago when I had one if that's normal. But no one has ever questioned me on it. I don't know a ton of beatboxers, but no one's ever questioned my K snare, my outwards anyway. And so that's something I should probably figure out. But I definitely would like to teach people how to do it that way because it sounds different. Again, you have a versus a, and maybe it's considered like a single gun cock noise instead of the double. I don't know. I could do it twice and it sounds very similar. And what's versatile about that type of K snare is by changing your mouth position slightly, you can change how that snare comes across and hits too. So just by default, it sounds like, if you tighten up a little bit, it sounds like, I'm essentially doing like a grin expression with my face to tighten up the area where that sound is resonating so it becomes sharper and higher in pitch. So again, it goes from to that type of K snare pairs really well with the zip as well for that like double technicality. I don't know what I call it, like a K zip pattern. Like a double zip plus that K, or K plus double zip sounds like. And you could do that really quickly if you practice that combination pattern, which is not a common one I really hear at all, which would be, which is like a 32nd or a 16th note zip kick combined with that K. I have to think about that one. But to me, I don't know if I can even do that with the regular K. No, I don't think so, because the one that I do, your mouth closes off on the end of it to cut the K snare off. So doesn't have to, but in order to get the zip to come out, you're putting your lips into the position where your mouth is closed. Hence the. And that's a bit more of an irregular pattern. I don't hear stuff that sounds like that super often. I'm sure it exists in the wild for beatboxing, but that's not a common combination of sounds. I haven't talked to any pros in the scene recently. I kind of have not really been engaged with the rest of the beatbox scene, just have been busy. But I maintain that the zip sound is very uncommon. I know people know about it, and I've heard some people talk about it before, but that's kind of a sound I've adopted as one of my signatures because it's a bit more uncommon. I'm not saying I invented it, but the way I do it is kind of unique. So I need to ask some people next time I talk to actual beatboxers if they're familiar with that sound, just because it's unusual, but it's fun to do. You can do a lot of interesting things with like high speed patterns with that, like I just did. But anyway, I wanted to do like a real quick sidebar to explain the difference in K snares, since, again, everything else I've learned has been pretty standard with the way it's taught and learned, but that one was different, and I've yet to figure out if it's got a name or if it's just a variant of a regular outwards K. Because like the inwards K, mine is done the same way as everybody else's, which is using air and on one side of the mouth. It's not a center inward K. That's much harder to do, and people that do that are not as common. And as far as the beginner progression of tools and people learning, I've said this before, and I've seen it demonstrated just when people telling stories of what they learned in beatboxing. The inwards K is probably the first beginner wall when it comes to learning a new technique. And you don't have to learn it, but learning that type of snare is pretty important, I think, for teaching you a different technique, but also giving you options when it comes to regulating airflow and leading into other things that we've talked about on stream before that are at the intermediate to advanced level. And so I would tell people not to get scared off by the inward K. It just takes probably the most time to figure out, and that one's hard to explain. I've talked through it on stream before, but it's a little easier if you can see someone's face and mouth and what they're doing with their anatomy to see how it works. But once you get it, it's just practicing getting it clean. It'll be kind of breathy and sloppy, like a. It kind of sounds soft when you're first learning it, but as you practice getting that motion down and getting really comfortable with it, it tightens up a lot and gets a lot cleaner, and you get the. One of my favorites to do because it helps with the air, but very difficult in the beginning. It's an irregular movement, hence the difficulty learning it. But seeing as though we're hitting the hour mark, I think I will call it there for the discussion on basics. It's something that we can talk about a lot for hours and hours, I think. But hopefully the revisiting of what it means to start off at the ground level and kind of build up in complexity will make sense to people. Again, it's not the only way to learn. I just think if I could go back and do it all over again, I would have focused on learning all of that stuff more before jumping into the more advanced stuff later. And everyone will be different. Everyone's approach to beatboxing is different, unless you're in a class or something. But it's definitely a good conversation to have. And maybe next time I talk about basics, I'll refer back to this particular stream for what I covered. And from there say, okay, how do we kind of advance the discussion without just rehashing the same thing over and over again, which I didn't do for today. I had a series of things I wanted to discuss, and I figured let's get through the discussion, and then next time we'll try and pick up where we left off when it comes to the basic discussion. So with that, let me change my caption, and I will explain what we're going to do for the remainder of the stream. Okay. So this is going to be a bit of an experiment, and I may have to explain this more than once if some people jump on and jump in midstream while I'm working on this. But I had this idea for a new kind of challenge format for the BGM creation. Normally, what I'll do is I'll go take the loop, and again, I've got my synthesizer hooked up, but it's off to get rid of the fuzz. I will basically put together ideas for a beat or a BGM track for us to use and construct it using all the different layers of the loop, and then I'll come back and discuss the whole thing with the chat and say, here's what I put together. Do we have any ideas for how to tweak things or things to change? And then we'll do that, move on to the next one, repeat the whole process, and that's generally been the format when it comes to doing the BGM brainstorming. The difference that I want to try for today, and we'll see how this works out and what the end results produce. In the caption, I have BGM Rush, which is what I'm calling this. This is a bit more of a speed challenge, kind of like I think it's called a game jam, where people get together and try and put together a video game quickly using like code and assets, and it's a challenge to put something functional together quickly. I want to take that idea and apply it to the BGM brainstorming. So what I'm going to do when I take off my mic boosts and turn on the synth is I'm going to jump straight into putting together an idea for a beat. I'm going to try and do it quickly and get a fully functional beat with all the components as fast as possible. And then when I feel like I've created something functional, not just slapping everything together without any thought, but once I feel like it's complete enough to be a functional product, I'm going to save it, move on to the next one, start from scratch, and I'm going to try and do these in rapid succession. So, where in the past it might be like 20 minutes to half an hour of me putting stuff together and then we talk about it. Instead, I'm going to try and knock a completed beat or track out in minutes, less than 10. 5 might be pushing it unless I do something very, very simple, but the point is to jump from one to the next quickly. And depending on how many I do, I'm going to look at the clock as opposed to the quantity. At some point, I'm going to stop and I want to go through everything because I don't want to just do this for like an hour straight with no discussion. I think that's going to be, one, difficult, and two, if people are coming and going, it's going to be really confusing because they won't hear me talking about stuff. But what I'll do is I'll do the first set and see if I can get through several, and then I'll stop, go back through each one and talk about it. If people jump on midstream and they want to know why I'm not talking or why I'm doing these kind of back to back, maybe I can circle back and explain it. Normally, I'd also say people that are actively watching can just mention to the rest of the chat if they wonder why I'm not talking what I'm doing. But because this is brand new, I've got no problem stopping and explaining it. But we're going for speed and quantity while trying not to lose quality. And that's not something I've tried before, so it should be interesting. So with that, I'm going to turn off my boosts and I'm going to go onto my synth and start putting stuff through. And so my model is probably going to wig out because I'm going to be looking at my synthesizer primarily, but I'll try and at least turn back every once in a while so it doesn't look like there's just a blank screen, since that would be even more confusing for people jumping on midstream. So with that being said, let's try it and we'll see what we create and then we will talk about it. All right. I'm gonna have to turn on my mic for every single one of these tracks since I don't have the boost enabled by default. So that's gonna be fun. But let's do sort of a quick wrap up of everything we just did. Again, testing out a new format for BGM, and we'll probably try this again in the future and see what people think as far as this particular format. But we created several BGM tracks in a row, again, working with the idea of speed. I'm trying to do this relatively quickly. So let's step back through, I think we did four or five. I think it was 4. So the first one was this kind of hip hop ish type beat. So let's take a listen. And I need to drop all of the mixing down a bit so I can talk over the beats. Okay, I think we'll leave it about there. Hopefully I can talk over the beats without being too drowned out. So this one starts with kind of an old school-ish hip-hop beat, kind of like an 80s era hip-hop beat, and lays in the bass line. What I'll do is I'll kind of talk through the track as a whole, since we're gonna have to go through each one of these relatively quickly before we wrap up. But the bass line is very simple. I think it's 2 total notes. It's like a single step or single note, step up, and then it goes back down. Very subtle because it's in the low end, so it's kind of hard to hear our note progression at all with the bass. But I think the most prominent sound you hear, at least the way I have it laid out, the final mixing, I might have to play around with the balance a bit. But the main instrument you hear is the synth. The most kind of ear-catching part of the whole thing is this rapid synth that it goes like a half step down, or maybe a full step down, and then it jumps up a couple notes. And this was using the slicer, and this is a string, I believe. I think it's one of the string synths run through the slicer to give it that consistent, rapid, chopped up sound. And then I played around the progression a bit. And then coming in on the 4th track, this only has 4 of the 5 filled. We have a kind of chime chord using one of the other synth presets just to sort of back up the main synth with something else that's going to play off of the bass a little bit. And so I don't know exactly what I would use this one for. This one could be used as like a rap beat, but for the actual verses, we'd have to take the synth out. It's a bit too dominant, and you'd hear it over everything else. So I think probably the way I would structure it for thinking about how this would be performed, maybe it would start with like a lead in, and then we have the beat plus the bass plus the chord. And then for the verses, the chord would drop out. And for however many bars of verses you would have, it'd be the bass line and the beat just by themselves. Maybe I could think of like a 5th thing to throw in there that's going to be not as distracting and kind of be good in the background. Then I think for the actual chorus, if you're going to structure it like a regular song with like versus, chorus, or yada, 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 the synth would come in, but I'd have to probably drop its volume down so that you can hear it in the background. But having that come in would denote when the chorus or the hook is playing in the background, and would probably supplement the song that way. That's the best way I could think of kind of structured if we were using this again to do like a rap song. So I'll have to think about that. There's a couple things I might be able to purpose this for, but it seems like a pretty functional beat to be able to use for something like that. If we just isolate the beat plus the bass line, I think I could see myself using this in like a rap challenge or something like that. It's pretty straightforward. It's not super fast, but you could probably play around with flow a little bit. And so this one's pretty functional. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to bother saving since we're going to jump through these pretty quickly. So this was the first beat we did in the rush. Let's look at the second one. Now I have to reset my boost real quick. All right. The volume is probably going to be a little bit inconsistent on my mic between these because I'm just eyeballing my mic settings real quick so I can talk. But that's okay. I think we'll be able to talk through these and kind of reflect on all the ideas that came together in, what was it, maybe about 40 minutes of trying to put together songs. So let's listen to this one from the top. All right. So for this one, I'm keeping the balance again kind of in the middle. This one's probably going to sound a little louder than the other one. But this is kind of a more electronic dubstep adjacent rhythm. The actual melodies and everything else are not really that dubsteppy at all. Maybe like post dubstep. But focusing on like an electronic type of sound. The kind of muffle filtered, that's a chorus synth right here on track 3. I like the idea of having these rhythmic chorus chords, which I've done on several songs, so I need to be a little careful on just doing the same thing over and over again. But having that, and I did this one manually, I didn't use Slicer for this one, I don't think. Maybe I did. I can't remember at this point. But I like how the chorus synth with its filter, it sounds kind of like a distorted chorus, and it's constant. It's 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, and it plays with the beat a little bit. Makes it sound almost kind of gospel-y, like something you'd hear in some sort of like holy ceremony maybe. But then you have the 2 synths on the end. So if we take the chorus out, this is too high. Oh, it's an oboe. I think it's an oboe on this one. On the end. And this is, I don't remember what this is. Maybe a saxophone? But it follows the progression of, I think this is the bass with a couple different notes switched out. So it does that 1 2 3 4. Is that a quadruplet rhythm? 1 2 3 4. Yeah, which is something I don't think I've done in that particular type of rhythm before. That's something a little unique. But I basically had the sliced, we'll assume it's a saxophone rhythm, and then I duplicated it with kind of like a filtered oboe. So it kind of almost sounds like an organ with the way the effects ended up on it. But I kind of like the way it's paired with the chorus synth and that constant rhythm. So it's got a sustained set of notes in the beginning, and then it does the moving 4 notes at the end. Kind of a different approach. Again, I don't think I've done something that sounds quite like that. And for this one, it would probably be a mix of either putting in like a filter at the track level, which would mute out the rhythm, And maybe we do like a filter transition. One potential way we could mix up the different sections of the track itself would be to have the high melody come and go. Maybe coming off the filter, we take it out like we've done here, then we bring it back later, and then for an outro, we kind of fade everything out and do it in order. I'll have to kind of think. I think there's a lot of potential to mix up just the way the order of these things plays that would affect the actual final track, which gives it a lot of options. And so that's the second one. Let's look at the third one. All right, reset my mic. This is the Bossa Nova one. No, this is the kind of rockish sounding one. Okay, let's listen to this one from the top. Oh, maybe I did do 5 of them. The one after this is the Bossa Nova one, I think. So this one, let me try and drop it down a little bit. This one's a bit loud too. There we go. This one is kind of a more RPG-ish sounding track. And this one takes a couple ideas from another one that I think is going to be part of an upcoming project that I put in. Specifically, it's that flute, which is track 3. And so this one I think would work out pretty well as like an RPG battle theme. It's got kind of an ominous and mysterious sound, but the fact that the bass line descends, I think gives it kind of a more sinister, ominous feel to it. So could be like a good boss theme, or maybe a unique encounter with some sort of antagonistic party. And the way I did this one was by just taking the distorted guitar, dropping it in the low end with some boost to give the bass line. It's basically playing lower register electric guitar for the bass line. And for this one, I could foresee maybe playing with the order, having stuff come in, drop out. No filter transition for like an RPG type track, but I think it would be pretty effective. And so this one might not be as complicated, but I do like the end result. I think it turned out simply but effective. And I think the track 3 would not be there the whole time, so that we're not just hearing that flute melody constantly. I think we bring it in, drop it out, and then kind of cycle through. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run to the little Raku's room real quick before we finish up with the last, I think, 2 tracks to explain. So I'm going to mute my mic, but I'll leave the track running. That way there's not dead silence, and I'll be back in just 1 minute. All right. Sorry about the delay. So that was the third track of, I think, 5. Let us move on to the next one, and then we'll get ready to wrap up for today. Okay, so this one was the bossa nova-ish type one, which I think bossa nova beats are really cool. I just don't know how to do too many different ones that still follow at least what I think is the thematics for that type of music. But let's listen to the whole thing. So this one actually, the beat itself is fast. Normally, from what I can gather, bossa nova songs aren't technically that fast in tempo. They're not rapid. But this one is coming in at 160, essentially, 159.9 beats per minute. That's relatively fast. And I think it's the fact that it's set by the rhythm. So that's what drives the overall track BPM, that everything syncs and loops to. But it's interesting because none of the other parts of the track, I was just listening to it for a sec, none of the other parts are relatively quick. They don't move around a whole ton. It's primarily just the beat, which makes it sound fast. And then everything else sort of balances, I think. So this track sounds like something you'd hear in like an ocean theme or like a sailing theme. I'm reminded of the whale theme from Breath of Fire 2, which I believe is kind of similar in style. It's like a bossa nova-ish track. But the rest of the components kind of balance out that sort of rapid rhythm, and then you get kind of a mix of like a melodic sound that's got kind of a quick tempo, but not so fast that it's really distracting. I may have to do some more research, like the bossa nova genre, and see kind of how people play around with the rhythms and tempo, because I would like to be able to compose more stuff in that style. I just don't want it to all sound the same. This one also features an accordion. I think it's the third instrument. Yeah, this one here. That is a filtered accordion. Got the filter running over it to give it a slightly different flavor. But that's this one. Kind of an interesting experiment. Now, let's look at the last one, and then we will wrap up the stream for today. All right, mic booster on. This is the electronic one, I believe. This one's more of like a dance song. Oh yeah, this one. This one kind of gives me some video gamey vibes to it. Sounds like something you would hear in like a futuristic video game, maybe kind of like a cyberpunkish type environment with the way the synths are. The rhythm is kind of a standard dance beat. I didn't really do a lot that weird with this one. But the rest of it, the bass line and a bunch of the synths, the two prominent ones, the bass line and the main synth you hear, I think those were both using different rhythms and inputs on the slicer effect. So it does chop them up, but it chops them up differently so they don't sound identical, which is kind of the intention. But I think overall, this one sounds kind of similar to some of the other ones, especially in Far Future Days, but it, to me, puts the ideas together in a little bit of a different manner, and I think it sounds a little bit more polished. Far Future Days was my first real attempt at like a techno-ish dance kind of album, and I feel like I've learned a lot about how to take these instruments and put them together into something that's going to be like an electronic and dance type beat and do that more effectively. And I want to continue to build on that and get better. So hopefully each future project that falls within like the electronica, dance, techno-ish genre sounds more refined and overall has a progression, so they don't all sound the same. But I could foresee this one having a lot of interesting little subsections where we're taking different parts of the rhythm, taking the rhythm out, or taking the synths or the bass line out and playing with those. We could filter this one too for transitions, but again, trying not to get into the habit of doing the same effect over and over again. That's kind of something to be wary of, not to get stuck into the same kind of pitfalls. Maybe dropping the balance of the kind of higher synths lower in the mix so they're not quite so aggressively at the forefront. Like, I'm thinking this is track 3. So that one we'd probably take out every once in a while and have it come in at certain times instead of playing constantly. It's not back to back, but I think it's the thing your ear is drawn to the most. So I would not want it to be really distracting. So all you're paying attention to is that high synth. And then we got like the pizzicato strings mixed in here to give it kind of like a light plucked sound. You can do some neat things with delays and kind of like an echo effect to make them sound like they're sort of bouncing. I didn't do that here, but because it's such a brief, short, like pluck sound, you could pair it with some of the input effects to make it more resonant and kind of elongated, which is fun. I think I've done that on a couple other tracks before with that type of instrument. You just don't want to overdo it because it sounds very unique, and you don't want the listener's ear to be drawn to just those plucked strings, but you can do a lot with them. So I like putting them in every once in a while. Even on non-electronic songs work pretty well. But that is the last one, I believe. So we did 5 tracks. If I had a bit more time to stream today, then I would probably try and do like another run through and see if I could do like another several back to back, and then we would talk about them and go through sort of all of the different pieces. But it was an interesting challenge. You got to think fast and not dwell too much on one single track and go through the motions, put everything together, and then once it's complete enough, instead of working on the different phases and how it would actually be recorded, just move on to the next one, get everything together, and then record it, get it looping, then move on to the next one. And so the BGM rush, I'd like to do again sometime. I don't know if we'll do it on the next stream since it'll be back to back, but it's a good sort of exercise in thinking quickly and coming up with ideas. And I think we have 5 somewhat distinct tracks that don't sound similar, and they're all in slightly different genres. So hopefully people watching this found it interesting. There's a big stretch of me not talking, I understand, but hopefully the process is interesting, and we'll revisit this again in the future. And then I'd be interested to come up with some ideas on how to get more interaction with the people watching, so that, as things are going, maybe people are dropping me hints or prompts for the next track. As I'm working on one, maybe like someone says, next one, do like another hip hop, or do like a synth wave song or something like that. That could be interesting. And then I'm basically running through the ideas people feed me in rapid succession. And then that'll drive what I'm doing, even though I'm not talking about it. So we'll see. Again, interesting experiment, but I think we will call it here. And normally I would set us up to raid someone, but I actually have to run out the door in a minute here. That's why I have to cut the stream off, and that's why I started early. So just for today, we will go ahead and go to outro, and we'll wrap up. I like to be able to hang out on people's streams that I raid for just a little while, just so I don't just raid and run. But for today, we'll just wrap up here. We will be back next week. I think I'm going to be setting a stream tomorrow on Monday. I don't know exactly what I'm doing yet, so I gotta plan out my schedule. That will go up before the end of the day today, so I will figure that out. But in the meantime, I hope everybody has a good rest of your day, and I will catch everyone in the next stream.